Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me. Sounds like the lectures this morning have been fantastic already. Happy to see you here visiting me as we talk about Zenlens and a new design feature called BioElevation. It's been such a game changer in the way that I fit patients, and it's really improved the way that lenses fit to eyes. And to be honest, I feel like it improves every fit. It's kind of become the new normal in my practice, and I use it a lot. And so we're going to dive in and talk about, how I use it and what might trigger us to use it on our patients. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Zenlens, first I'm going to go over a quick introduction on the design, just to bring everybody up to speed. And then we're going to talk about how did BioElevation come to be? What sparked us to talk about BioElevation and, what brought the design to life. Then we're going to talk about how BioElevation helps and the difference that it can make in your fits and how we do it. Then we'll talk about implementing it into practice based on the technology that you have available to you. In a nutshell, the Zenlens has some fitting features that I think everybody should know about. They have both a spherical, toric, and a quadrant peripheral curve design. So whatever you need there to best fit your patient, we have the ability to best align it to the ocular surface. And then, of course, we've added in the BioElevation to better align. So rather than calling this fitting features, I guess I would say these are our alignment features. These are the things that are going to help us align that lens to the ocular surface. There's tons of other fitting features, of course, that we'll go through closer to the end. But when it comes to aligning it to the eye and kind of honing in on the need for the BioElevation, these are the types of designs that we'll be working with. The Zenlens is available in 4 diameters. We have 14.8, 15.4, 16, and 17 millimeters. Initially, the smaller diameters were kind of geared at those normal corneas, maybe your high astigmats or patients needing maybe like a multifocal that weren't happy with their vision in their traditional soft contact lenses. But as the design has grown and I've become more accustomed to using all diameters, I kind of use them across the board just based on when I see fit. So you don't necessarily have to niche those small diameters for your normal corneas anymore. I use lots of 15.4 diameters on eyes with corneal transplants or patients that have had RK before. It just really fits beautifully around those post-surgical eyes. Some other customizable things about Zenlens that you should know before we dive into BioElevation. Optics, we can do spherical and toric optics as well as a multifocal. Again, the customizable APS that we talked about on that previous slide. So we can do a toric landing curve, a quadrant specific landing curve, which they call quad sim technology. And next we have a microvault, which we use this microvault as, I like to call it a speed bump, but it's basically a guided lift in the landing curves to guide over pinguiculas, maybe some small pterygiums, things like that. A nice thing about the microvault is that it is designed into the lens through the focal points design software, so that this is not done by hand. It's a computerized design so that if you need to order a duplicate lens, let's say you're ordering the lens, you have the microvault and you need a power change, you can order the exact same microvault on the next lens and it will look exactly the same, different from, previously we had to do like handmade notches into the lens to work around large pinguiculas. And that's no longer needed with the microvault. So just, enables that precision and reproducibility compared to hand notching. And then next, we're going to move into that BioElevation. So when we talk about it in these next slides, it can sound complicated, but really what I want you to understand that it's just like addressing the previously that we would, use toric peripheral curves or that quad sim peripheral curve technology. It's utilizing that closer to the limbal area to better align the lens to the surface. And so that's really what it's all about, is basically aligning the lens more closely, tighter to the cornea in instances where you see, lens decentering, lens movement, chamber fogging, where you're just really struggling with that lens to bear evenly across the ocular surface. That's where BioElevation is going to kick in and really help you. And really the source of all of those things, of that, decentration, fogging, et cetera, is instances of uneven limbal clearance, and we're going to get into that next. So that scleral misalignment, what have we discovered? What are the sources of that misalignment? So in this part of the discussion, I'm going to talk about scleral lenses and in kind of an anatomy type description. So I'm going to walk you through the terminology that I like to use when I'm teaching about scleral lenses, and then we'll get into kind of the nuts and bolts of the bioelevation design. So in a scleral lens, as you've learned in-depthly already in these last day and a half, we'll have the optical zone, and that of course holds the lens power, and it's described by the base curve of the lens. Then we have the mid-peripheral zone, which completes the vaulting chamber. So the optical zone and the mid-peripheral zone, that's the vaulting chamber of the lens. So on the far periphery of that mid-peripheral zone, that's where the lens is going to start to land on the ocular surface of the eye, so just past the limbus. And then, of course, we have the landing zone, the lens haptics. In the Zenlens, we call it the APS, or the Advanced Peripheral System. So when I look at these things, it's very common for the landing zone to be described as the foot of the lens. If we have edge impingement, we call it toe down. If we have, impingement or tightness toward the limbus, we can call it heel down. Or if you have edge lift, sometimes they'll call that heel down. And so that's kind of the foot of the lens. Now, the bioelevation moves the ability for the lens to align better to the ocular surface a little more inward toward the center of the lens. And so bioelevation is going to happen up in this area, and we like to call that the knee of the lens. So the lens actually changes at the knee, the junction of the optical zone and the mid-peripheral zone, to really bring that edge down and align better when we have uneven clearance over the limbal area. And as I show you some images, I promise that this will become more clear. Historically, when we fit scleral lenses, it's always been about scleral shape. Those of you who have been fitting scleral lenses for a long time and you've attended other lectures, guaranteed you've attended a lecture called, the science of scleral shape, or scleral shape this, scleral shape that. It's always been about scleral shape. It's been, let's clear the limbus, and now we talk about scleral shape. So all we've done is looked at toric peripheral curves, quad peripheral curves. Even, there are designs out there that can get even more specific than that, because it's always been about the landing curves. When we see a scleral topography like you have in this image here, we just ignore the entire cornea and we go right to the peripheral curves. And we look, okay, this one would probably do great in a toric peripheral curve. So again, we've kind of ignored what happens more inward at the limbus and even within the cornea itself. And that's where our, assumptions of the cornea and scleral shape have kind of led to some of those problems with chronic fogging and, what's been lacking in previous designs. You can see here that we have two lenses spinning on axis. Of course, the spherical lens is going to look the same 360 degrees. And then we have this toric lens spinning, and we can just see those little edges of the landing curves, about 2 millimeters or so, lifting and coming down as the edges flatten and steepen to align to the ocular surface. But our mistake is assuming that the limbus and cornea, if you were to separate it from the sclera and set it on a flat, countertop, that the limbus would be even 360 degrees around. And if that was true, all toric lenses or quad lenses would fit beautifully, because the chamber is spherical, and then we just have these little tiny adjustment curves to best fit the lens to the eye. And so when we put toric lenses on pretty highly toric eyes, sometimes we still end up with pictures like we see in the bottom. Primarily this middle picture here where, gosh, I have a pretty toric lens on a pretty toric eye, and I'm still getting edge lift superiorly, or I'm still getting lens movement, chamber fogging, pumping through that lens as the eye looks around. You may, I went one too far here. We might even see in like this image on the right, this fluorescein that extends, inferiorly because the lens is maybe decentered a little bit. We can continue to, crank down on that edge up here or flatten these up here, but we're still, missing the boat on this misalignment over here at the limbus. And so again, that's what we're going to talk about on improving our fits with bioelevation. So now let's talk about how we can use corneal and limbal shape in addition to scleral shape to best align lenses to eye. So now we're going to look at this scleral topography with a little bit different approach. Of course, we can see that the sclera is kind of atypical. It's maybe not even toric. We might need, something more specific on this because it doesn't really follow a pattern. But look at this, this corneal toricity and how it extends toward that limbus. And if you were to put, separate this cornea from its sclera and place it on a countertop, the vertical meridian is much deeper than the horizontal meridian. So it's actually going to sit on a tabletop more like a Pringles chip than, say, a perfect dome, like a soft contact lens sitting on a countertop. And that's where bielevation comes in to give that lens chamber that same Pringles chip shape so that now we can evenly bear the weight of the lens 360 degrees around the limbus. Looking at this pentacam image over here, most of us are used to looking at tangential or axial maps, and we would say, oh, keratoconus, let's put a scleral lens on and off we go. But again, we actually should start looking at elevation maps of the cornea. And you can see that, look at the elevation difference between the vertical meridian and the horizontal meridian. The horizontal meridian is much higher, or if we were looking at this eye in the slit lamp, closer to us, and the vertical meridian of the cornea falls away. It's further away from us. And that's just the corneal and limbal shape itself. And if we expect, a spherical shaped chamber to land evenly and even center over this kind of shape, we've been mistaken. We're asking a lot of those, 1.5 to 2 millimeter peripheral curves to compensate for all of this surface toricity. And that's where bielevation comes in. It's going to help us, again, better align to that uneven shape of the corneal and limbus area, so that now we can truly align the lens. And when we bring that chamber down so that it can actually follow the up and down shape of the limbus, now we can fully utilize the landing curves to best align to the eye, which I'll show you in a couple more slides. So again, as we've alluded to before, if you're struggling with a lens that decenters, it moves up and down, it sits low, you're worried about the superior limbus, and all you want to do, like this picture here, you can see how inferiorly decentered this lens is over the inferior limbus, to the point where we're actually, kind of hinging on the superior limbus. And if I were to open up these limbal curves to get off the superior limbus, guess what? It would just continue to decenter further. Actually increasing limbal clearance in the vertical meridian would make the fit worse because it just gives it more room to decenter further. What we really need to do is, again, get that vertical meridian of the chamber to align to the limbus, and now we'll get that proper limbal clearance. So again, if you're struggling with lens decentration, impingement in the edges, chamber fogging, compression rings, because again, the lens just is kind of falling and digging into the conjunctiva because we can't get that even bearing 360 degrees around, that's where bielevation is really going to help you. Another thing that I think is worth mentioning here is conjunctival prolapse. Being able to better align the lens to the eye and keeping that even limbal clearance 360 degrees around has really improved some of my patients, the way their eyes look, the way their eyes feel, by decreasing that conjunctival prolapse. So what does bielevation actually do? So as you can see in this simulation here, the lens base curve is at the top, of course, and then we have this mid-peripheral zone, these two purple colors here. And I see your raised hand there, and I'll grab some questions at the end. This lighter purple here, that's the area of the lens smart curve, which is actually a really neat, innovative part of the scleral lens that helps compensate. If you're going to change sagittal depth, the smart curve will compensate the change so that you don't have to change the lens base curve. You can just ask for more sagittal depth. If you change the peripheral curves and you steepen it, which you would expect the lens to prop up a bit and actually gain some sagittal depth, the smart curve will absorb that so that you don't have to compensate sagittal depth and base curve, or whatever else you would do to compensate for any other peripheral curve changes. So the smart curve is really a neat part of the lens design that it basically, you can change one thing about the lens and not have to change anything else to compensate for those changes. So the smart curve, when you add in the bielevation, in the meridian that you want bielevation, the smart curve actually extends down toward the limbal area to help align that outer part of the midperipheral chamber closer to the ocular surface. That allows us to bring the foot or the heel of the APS all the way down, so that now, instead of trying to hinge an entire fit on just the toe of the lens, we can actually utilize the entire landing zone. So it helps bring that heel to toe alignment of the APS onto the ocular surface on these toric eyes, so that we can, again, utilize that entire grip or that entire foot of the lens design onto the ocular surface. And bielevation actually comes from, because when you extend this smart curve and midperipheral curve area, they actually get longer. There is more lens in that meridian. And so again, if you were to set it on a tabletop, it would, again, look like that Pringles chip, where one meridian is going to be deeper because it aligns to the deeper part of the eye, the part that's further away from you in the slit lamp, usually the vertical-ish meridian. The other meridian is the horizontal meridian typically, and that's the one that's closer to you. So the lens has actually two sagittal depths. It has the horizontal sagittal depth, which is going to be the part of the lens that touches first, and then the vertical part of the lens that touches further away from you. And we have some graphics coming up to hopefully help support that imaging in mind. And again, there's a lot of descriptions and things like that can make this sound complicated, but I promise you, this is something that you can definitely do in your practice. Does not have to be a troubleshooting part of your fit. If you see a lens that decenters right out of the fitting set, you should be using bielevation. You don't have to save it to be a troubleshooting part of your lens. So here's the difference between a toric lens and a bielevation lens. You can actually see in that bielevation lens, you can see in the deeper meridian where that lens extends and it steepens up to align to the steeper part of the limbal curves. So you can see how much further down that lens reaches. So when it looks like that top hat type shape, it actually reaches down further to the eye to reach the ocular surface. And, we just can't do that with toric peripheral curves. The amount of change that we can add to these lenses is it's nothing compared to what the bielevation can do. So let's walk through a couple images here and hopefully help you see a little more about how bielevation looks and how it works on an eye. So here we have a corneal scleral image and a corresponding lens, which I'll talk about in a second. The dark purple here is the deeper meridian of the eye. So this is the part of the eye that's further away from me when I look at them in the slit lamp. And then this is the meridian, the lighter purple is the meridian that's closer to me in the slit lamp. So the taller part, or the taller part of the eye, again, closer to me. And then we have the deeper part of the eye falling further away from me. And you can see that here. If we were to kind of draw them on a single plane, we have the shallow part of the eye here, which is that, more horizontal, I guess, or that 30 to 210 meridian. And then we have the deeper meridian in the dark purple. So let's put a spherical lens on the eye. The lens is going to hit in the meridian that's closest to me, right? So it's going to land in this 30 to 210 meridian right here. And the lens is going to rock in the 210 to 300 or 120 to 300 meridians, because it's going to teeter totter. It's going to land, in the, I guess, horizontalish or that light purple meridian. And then as it's trying to reach the opposite meridian, it's going to rock or even move up and down with blinks because it doesn't have good peripheral alignment. So historically, what we would do is what we see in this image here. We would, what we think is let's steepen the landing curves, quite a bit to try and get that lens to center up, decrease chamber fogging, decrease lens movement. So all we can do is we just pull the toe of the lens down toward the ocular surface. And we do touch the ocular surface, but really this is all we're getting here is that tiny little bit of touch that you can see in this fluorescein pattern in that top right picture. And again, how do you think this tiny bit of touch against the ocular surface is going to stop movement, stop chamber fogging, I bet there's even intermittent liftoff in a lens like this as the patient moves their eye around. So again, when all we can do is steepen the toes, pull the edge down, and this is what we're hinging on. We don't get to use that entire foot of the landing curve without the use of bielevation. So now let's look at the same eye. We have our primary meridians here, and we use a lens that has bielevation. So we have our 2D eye here in the purple, and then the blue or the light blue is the shallow meridian of the bielevation. The shallow meridian of the bielevation matches what comes out of your diagnostic set. So when you put the lens on you grab it from your diagnostic set and you put it on eye, the lens touches again that shallower meridian, or the meridian that's closest to you when you look at the patient in the eye, when you look at the patient in the slit lamp. But what the bielevation does now, instead of just steepening the edge of the lens to get that, toe down appearance, we actually get to utilize the full landing curves because the lens actually gets longer in that meridian so that we get the heel down and the toe to fully align to the ocular surface. And this is where that bielevation comes from, because we have a deep meridian and we have a shallow meridian that add up to the same point at the top. And so sometimes people get confused with the term bielevation because they think, centrally it's bielevation. Is it a toric base curve? Where no, it's not. It's actually these mid-peripheral curves are where the toricity happens to extend that lens down to the ocular surface. So you think about, the apex as your 0 point, and then measure how far down we go. So we have meridian 1 in the light blue, meridian 2 in that teal color, so that we can utilize both the superior and superior, inferior, and then the horizontal meridians. We can use the APS 360 degrees. So fitting for success. You can do this with a scleral topographer, which is very helpful because it gives you some really nice exact measuring points. And you can also do it with your diagnostic set. So let's talk about using scleral profilometry first. All you do is you would take your image and then you change your cord length to the size of the chamber. This one is set up for a 16 millimeter Zenlens, and the chamber is a 12.8. So you take your cord length and you change it to the 12.8, and then you're going to get your toricity measurements right here. So it would tell you, the sag differences that you can see here, how much sag difference is at the limbus area. And then you would change your change your cord length to the lens diameter, which is in this case, the 16 millimeter lens. And now it's going to tell you the difference and the sags in those same meridians, just further out. The first one, the difference in the vertical and horizontal meridians, that's how much bielevation you need. Over here is the total toricity of the ocular surface. And so this number here includes the amount of bielevation. So you would subtract the amount you're putting into the bielevation from what's calculating in the total to get how much toricity that you would then need in the APS. This particular software here helps spit out some peripheral curves of the Zenlens. It has the Zenlens software in there, but it doesn't matter. You can use any scleral topography to get those numbers. You just need to know your chamber size of the lens diameter that you're working with. So how do we do this in a fitting set? The Zenlens has a new fit set, the Zenlens design, and in this part of the lens set, you're what we call the core set. It could be spherical. It's a regular Zenlens design with spherical or toric peripheral curves. And then the rest of the set is kind of up to you. We're going to have small diameters to the left. To the right, if you get really comfortable with bielevation like I have, and you want a lot of bielevation lenses in your fit set, you can change this wing to all bielevation trials if you want. So you have multiple sags, multiple diameters. In the standard fit set, if you did not want bielevation, it would be the opposite of what your core set is. So if you like spherical APS curves in your core set, these would be toric APS curves, or vice versa. Myself, I like spherical APS curves because I feel like it's a more simple approach. And then I have a bunch of bielevation lenses in my right wing. And then we have 6 open slots down here. You could have a multifocal, you could have a lens with a microvault, you could have a really deep lens if you want, or a really shallow one if you're seeing lots of patients with grafts or RK. just a really fun, customizable fitting set. But again, if you are doing biolevation, then you can have, varied 2 biolevation amounts and varied sagittal depths to help you bracket and identify how much biolevation you need. Basic fitting approach here as we wrap up is, of course, we're going to select the lens from our fitting set as you normally would in the fitting guide. And this is something you would see if you put on that spherical chamber on an eye that needs biolevation. Make sure you fill that bowl up with fluorescein. I use fluorescein on all my new fits now. Once again, I did when I first started fitting scleral lenses, and then I stopped because I got really comfortable evaluating sagittal depth. But now moving back into biolevation, it's really helpful to see that fluorescein bleed across the limbus where you're not getting that heel to toe bearing of the lens. So whenever you see that oval shaped fluorescein pattern within the chamber, that's when that's going to cue you to use biolevation. In this case, we decided, okay, let's add 300. So your sags would be whatever your fitting set lens is, say 4,500, would be 4,500 by 4,800. This one gets a little bit complicated, and it's mostly used for eyes that have already wearing a Zenlens with a toric peripheral curve. But basically what it tells us is if you have a lens that has, say, 300 microns of toricity in the lens, APS, and we decide to put 300 microns into the biolevation, just like we subtracted it out of our, when you were using your scleral profilometry calculations, you would take it out of the APS. So be honest, this slide we won't get too entangled into because consultation will be able to help you, but basically it just says that we can take toricity out of the APS if we're adding it into the area of biolevation. Lastly, again, it sounds like a complicated topic, but I promise that once you get going, biolevation, it puts your fitting on fire. It is just awesome. And it really, really helps with, those patients that have routinely struggled with chamber fogging and things like that. Make sure you reach out for the training and support resources. We have area managers that are NCLE certified, amazing consultation team. You can even ask for a peer to come in and do some training or a wet lab in your clinic. These are just some of the other awesome things that Zenlens has. We have the multifocal, of course, the microvault. All of this is powered by that smart curve technology, which makes it so efficient in fitting. And of course, all the legal fun stuff for you. I'm going to reach into my chat box here and just see if there's any big questions. And then it's time for your meet and greets at the exhibit hall in the booth. There's a question for handouts. You can find that in the booth. So just go to the exhibit hall and that's where you'll find handouts. And then Q&A, how much asymmetry would you start? So a question in the Q&A was, what kind of triggers me to start using biolevation? If I see scleral profilometry, 150 microns, 125 microns, that's when I would start using it. And I would say most of my patients are around 250 to 300. So that's a really great place to start. If you see that oval fluorescein pattern, like I showed in that image, and you order biolevation and you get that the oval actually flips to where now it's in the opposite meridian, that can be your cue that you actually overshot the amount of biolevation that you need. If you overshoot your biolevation, you would actually see a sagittal depth increase as well. So if you think you have a really nice fitting diagnostic lens and it's 300 microns of clearance, you order a lens with biolevation and now you have 500 microns of clearance, you overshot your biolevation. So cut it down a bit, and that'll give you an idea. That'll help you kind of bracket where your need for biolevation is. Another question: can you order a biolevation Zenlens through the profilometry without using the diagnostic set? You could technically, if you knew the power of the lens you were going to order, you could, if the patient's already in a Zenlens and base curve and power, and you used, say the Eaglet or one of the other lenses or other profilometers to design the lens for you. I mean, technically you could do it without the fit set, but you have to know, what power of lens you want. Can I clarify, last question, can I clarify what is meant by the appearance closer to me in the slit lamp? So closer to me in the slit lamp is elevated, as in, the distance from me to the ocular surface of the patient. It's the conjunctiva or the sclera that's tallest. And then there's going to be part of the sclera that's further away because the eye is curved, so if you think of toricity, just thinking about, the cornea too, the horizontal meridian is closer and then the vertical is further away, because it's just the entire cornea, not just the sclera is toric, but the cornea and limbus is toric as well. So when I say closer to me, I mean the flatter meridian, if you would, and then the steep meridian is the meridian that's further away from me when I'm looking at the patient in the slit lamp. We find that clearance often needs to be less than 300 for a good VA. I wouldn't say that's true in all cases, but 300 microns is a really great place for a scleral lens to be in many designs, so 200 to 300 microns of vault over the cornea. I would consider that kind of an optimal place to be. Some eyes may need a little deeper if they have a spongy conj, and I don't know that it necessarily decreases visual acuity or quality. Excessive vault definitely can, but again, 300 is a great place to be for a scleral lens vault. Now, if I don't have any other questions, I think our events team is going to pop on and give some instructions on how to navigate through the exhibit hall. Thanks again for joining me, everybody, and head on over to the booth and somebody will be there to provide more information.